Living Justice, a restorative justice approach to reintegration.
The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes.
Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, Director of Restore. I've been working in prisons since 2005 and involved in restorative justice since then inside prisons, running victim awareness programs. I was able to complete my Master's in Restorative Justice at Hull University in 2010, and our NGO Restore was born. In 2020, COVID-19 forced us to relook at many things, and this reintegration initiative was birthed in that time through collaboration.
Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa Pediachi. I'm a social worker by profession and have worked in prison, reintegration, and the restorative justice space, both with victims and offenders for the past 27 years. For 25 of those years, I worked for an NGO called NICRO and co-founded my own NGO in 2016 called Midway Services. Lisa and I started collaborating a few years ago, and we are now working together on the WCCORYS model, which we will explain a bit later in the presentation.
We are diving into the theme, living justice, for this RJ world, and particularly around ecosystems, desiring to engage communities and institutions with the big picture, and ultimately seeing mindsets shifted towards a restorative paradigm. Today, we hope to look more in depth at reintegration through a restorative justice lens, looking at some stories where we can grasp key foundational principles related to this topic. We will also touch briefly on restorative justice in South Africa and its context here. We then aim to introduce you to a reintegration model used by the WCCORYS network. And finally, we will look at one session of a participatory action research project where the ex-offenders themselves unpack reintegration from their perspective. Although the current work is focusing on offender reintegration in order to curb recidivism with the hope of violence prevention, we recognize that victims, survivors of crime also need reintegration and safe spaces to do this. Part of the training covers circle processes, and we hope churches can become a safe space in the height of crime and violence. We recognize that hurting people hurt people. In a class of 14 young men in prison, there were over 6,000 accounts of their own victimization, recognizing that there is continuous trauma in our communities that needs to be dealt with. From Vanessa and I, we would like to say what a privilege and honor it is to be here and share on the RJ World platform. And we look forward to collaborating with you further down the line.
So Lisa's going to tell us about two stories. And storytelling is actually quite a powerful methodology we use in our training and in our practice. These two stories underpin the value of using restorative justice in reintegration. What we have found through storytelling is that people start to heal the moment they feel heard.
So I'm going to be sharing from a book today, Restoring Justice, an introduction to restorative justice by Dan Van Ness and Karen Strong. And I'm taking the story from here as well as the key principles. So the story is the famous story Les Mis that many of us might know from movies or the theater or even the book. One of the central characters in Victor Hugo's classic story is Jean Valjean, a man who stole bread for his starving nephew and ultimately served 19 years in prison. After his release, Valjean's prospects were hindered by the requirement that he present documentation of his convict status wherever he goes, with the result that he was repeatedly denied work and shelter. This practical burden only compounded the bitterness and hardness of heart that Valjean had developed over the years. Physically, he was an exceptionally strong man, but he had become stunted in spirit and filled with hatred. His redemption began one night after police arrested him for a theft committed earlier in the evening. He had robbed a poor but generous bishop who had given him food and shelter, making off with the household silver. When the police discovered the bishop's silver, they forced Valjean to return to the bishop's house to be confronted by the churchman. If the bishop denounced him, Valjean was doomed to either more years in the wretched conditions of prison or execution. However, instead of accusing Valjean of robbery, the bishop told the police that the silver was a gift to Valjean and publicly made a further gift of 2 valuable silver candlesticks. He bade Valjean to go in peace as an honest man and to return any time as a welcome guest. The bishop addressed Valjean as my brother, telling him, "You belong no longer to evil, but to good." Nearly faint with shock and relief at this utterly incomprehensible turn of events, Valjean, as if by habit, stole money from a child only a short time later. The contrast between the identity called out for Valjean by the bishop and the perversity of this petty theft finally broke through his hardness of heart. What are the 4 critical gifts pointed out in the story when looking at reintegration? How can we as community be a catalyst for both victims and offenders? If we look at Valjean's bishop, the 4 critical gifts are safety and protection, by telling the police that the silver was a gift. Respect, the bishop demonstrated respect for Valjean's dignity and worth. He is labeled convict, but the bishop calls him brother and transforms his identity. Practical and material help, the bishop freely gives him food, a bed, and his valuable silver. Moral and spiritual beacon, by forgiving him, challenging him to be better than he has been, and demonstrating faith that such change was possible. Restorative justice places a high value on taking the steps needed to help both victims and offenders re-enter their communities as whole contributing members. And I'm going to be sharing a second story from this book, Compassionate Justice by Christopher Marshall. It has so many hidden gems in it that you could spend months and months and months unpacking it. But we're just going to touch very briefly on a small point around reintegration. So the story of the prodigal son captures reintegration and restorative justice so well. There are so many symbols from this story that we don't have time to focus on them all. But in a nutshell, we know that the son breaks many laws, disrespects his father, and in that culture, it would be seen as the son wishing his father dead by demanding his inheritance. He then goes off to a faraway land, squanders the inheritance, and ends up in poverty and ruin, in a pigsty. He then hits rock bottom and comes to his senses. He starts the long journey home, and nearing his home, his father sees him from a distance and rushes out to meet him. Hanging his head in shame, he reluctantly receives his father's embrace. His father then bestows on him a ring, a cloak, and sandals, and calls his servants to kill the fattened calf for celebration, as his son that was lost had returned. Our focus in this presentation is around the aspect of shame and stigma and how the celebration, the killing of the fattened cow, reestablishes and restores his son back to family and community. Shame is both interior and exterior. It is often the offender who says, when we come out, they label me as a thief, a criminal, waiting to shame me. With outward shame comes a social stigma, reproach from others that needs to be publicly removed if the bearer of shame is to be rehabilitated. That is why the father tops off his restorative gesture by going public and throwing a lavish party. Feasts were not a common occurrence in village life, and few could afford to eat meat. So when the father orders the slaughtering of the fattened calf that had been fattened for a special occasion, he confers a massive honor to his son. The festival gathering envisioned is obviously very large. The fattened calf could feed hundreds of people. It is surmised that the feast was to draw public attention to the father's success in peacemaking, as well as to build bridges of reconciliation of the alienated village community. What can we draw from this part of the story regarding a restorative response around reintegration? Do we celebrate those who are repentant and wanting to change? And what would that look like in this day and age? Restorative justice can help both the victim, offender, and community reach the point of understanding towards restoration and reconciliation, where celebration might happen. We as restorative practitioners need to come with mindsets of celebration. The boy deserved reprimand and punishment. At the very least, he merited a long period of probation to demonstrate the genuineness of his reform. Instead, the father moves with lightning speed and in a flood of symbolic gestures to restore him to full belonging. This parable also gives us a model for the church. It is challenging the people of God to shift their thinking towards compassion, while the wider community often judges former offenders to be treacherous, worthy only of punishment. To do this is to imitate the compassion of God, and it is equally to imitate the justice of God. His law-abiding son was also always doing the right thing. The father is forced to defend himself against the narrow rules-based notion of justice, which is advocated by his law-abiding son, as opposed to restorative justice. We can see social stigma needs to be publicly removed. Bridges of reconciliation need to be built. There needs to be celebration and recovery of relationship.
So before we move on to telling you more about the WCCORYS model, we just thought we would present a little bit of the context of South Africa and restorative justice. So as many of you may know, South Africa's violent crime rates are unprecedented. There are overcrowded prisons, high unemployment rates, 34% and 66% of youth unemployment, poverty, inequality, an overburdened criminal justice system, and continuous trauma. Now, restorative justice itself is not new to African communities, but in South Africa, the first known restorative justice process was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that was initiated by the Government of National Unity post-1994 to look at the atrocities of apartheid. Later on, we see there was a process to establish a new system of justice for children. And in 2008, the Child Justice Act came into being. And restorative justice was an underpinning value and principle of this policy. Later on, we see national policies by the state, including by the Departments of Justice, the National Prosecuting Authority, and Correctional Services. Restorative justice presently is run pre-trial in prisons, community, and in schools. There are practitioners doing restorative justice like NGOs Nikro Kalisa, Restorative Justice Center. Inside prison, we see Hope Prison Ministry, Restore, which Lisa's organization, and the Prison Care and Support Network. Recently, we also established the South African Restorative Justice Coalition to really begin to deepen the work of restorative justice in the country, to share and learn from each other's practice, and to form a network of practitioners and other role players across the country. You may ask yourself, what is reintegration? So re-entry to community life by former offenders as whole contributing productive persons. This means acceptance of the person as a member of the community. So building a reintegrative response is key. Presently in South Africa, this is an under-addressed area in restorative justice. Parole and aftercare practice has been focused historically on the offender and the offender's needs and risks, mainly supervising and monitoring the parole of the offender. Inclusion is key to prevent marginalization and stigma. So the WCCORYS model is basically all about building a reintegrative response. Faith communities are seen as agents of change. In light of the stories told, the WCCORYS model aims to engage the church and the community and challenge mindsets towards the paradigm of a restorative justice approach. The model incorporates a network of church leaders who are trained in a trauma-informed restorative approach, engaging the community and other key role players and mentoring towards restorative reintegration and other violence prevention projects. There are geographical clusters that facilitate networking, collaboration, and a coordinated response. There are also engagement with community and other stakeholders working on violence prevention. The approach is community-led and community-based, with participatory processes for communities to participate and engage in. The WCCORYS model also, after training, mentors projects that are emerging from the churches, and also implements a monitoring and evaluation system towards impact and duplication. The idea is that there can be a multiplication of restorative interventions across church networks and in community. Just to share with you some of the exercises we used in our training. One of the exercises was called the card exercise. So basically we started a session with asking, what is justice? What does justice mean for you? So we asked it at the beginning of the workshop, and then we asked the same question again at the end of the workshop. These were some of the responses. So the first response to what does justice mean for you? One participant said, it means law. After the workshop, the participant said it means mercy. Another participant said, justice means to me that my hurt is attended to or addressed. After the workshop, justice is mercy, compassion, and love. Another participant said, justice is to set right what went wrong. And after the workshop, they were able to unpack that justice was about prevention, trauma counseling, behavior change programs, and to interrupt violent processes. Another participant said, justice for me is to judge righteously, doing what's right, correction, to judge fairly, fairness, equality, respect, honesty. And at the end of the workshop, justice is restoration, love, and forgiveness. And then lastly, a participant said, justice equals fairness and peace of mind. And at the end of the workshop, justice is understanding the victim. Restorative justice starts with yourself. So we ran a 15-week program with church leaders, and we ran a follow-up workshop after 6 months. Coming out of the follow-up workshop, we could see that projects, some were new, some deepened, and others were replicated. We began to see emerging that church leaders were finding it important to do self-care, that in working with high-risk communities and in violence prevention, they had to be aware of their own triggers. This was taught in the workshop. We also saw a project called Orphans and Vulnerable Children, where the project was established to prevent recruitment and children for gangs. A mom's program to prevent family breakdown and empower women. There were also breakfast workshops being held by church leaders, hosted by the local church, and inviting other community leaders to attend. We also see that there was a partnership with the South African Police Service in terms of a project called the Spiritual Crime Prevention Project. We also see outreaches where church leaders went out into the community instead of inviting people to come to their church buildings to meet the community where they were at and to engage them around violence prevention. Interesting, we saw some churches reviewing their church practice to see if it was restorative and how they can implement restorative justice and circle processes within their church in dealing with conflict and violence. So from a trauma-informed perspective, people were beginning to, one church ran a project for children, and they began identifying processes regarding children within the church and to understand better unresolved trauma issues and how these were manifesting in behavioral issues. Another interesting project by some of the leaders and their church teams was a circle session held with boys in a school, and the conversation was about gangster violence and its effects on the community. And finally, there was another project on mentoring and coaching with high-risk youth.
So I wanted to just chat briefly about participatory action research. In 2021, we embarked on a participatory action research project with 8 ex-prisoners from our NGO. In a small way, this falls into a support group for reintegration category. This can be described as looking to others who have been in similar situation to create a community for at least some part of the journey towards reintegration. It has been a fascinating journey. There have been some obstacles along the way with COVID stopping and starting the meetings, but we have most of the guys buy-in. The awesome thing about this project is that we are empowering and equipping them to be the researchers, acknowledging that they have the best answers, questions, and solutions to problems and needs in their community. Who better to talk about reintegration than those that have been in prison and are coming out? In one of the sessions, we unpacked reintegration and what it means for them. And here is a slide with a breakdown. Some said they needed to go their own way. What they did need was a routine or a cycle in their lives when they come out. They needed to go somewhere positive. They felt perhaps making a plan in prison would help. It was important to associate with positive people. There was a supportive connection on the inside too. Our Restorative Justice project and then the follow-up project Inside Out gave them hope. They felt that a mentor was key. Trust was a big thing for them. Many struggled to trust, yet they said because they had met us on the inside, they could trust us on the outside, yet they were still struggling to trust their family. They felt mediation could play a role. They recognized the prison gang flips one's mind around. What they wanted from the community was respect and praise. The need for resources post-prison was huge. Restorative justice was important to them. They saw their criminal record as a hindrance, and having revenge and grudges could also be a hindrance. Self-defense and gangs could also be a hindrance, as well as stigma and mindsets. And I just want to say, if we just take this model, and even in that one session, we took the points that they referred to what they needed, we could probably draw up an amazing model, whether it be within the community, within the church, of those very points. Are there mentors? Is there a positive role model? Is there a positive place for them to step into as they come out? Is there a connection between someone on the inside and someone on the outside for them? So there's some phenomenal points we can draw from here of them sharing their needs. How do we build that trust? How do we work on the thinking that was flipped, the mindsets that were flipped? So I'm just excited to say this is out of the mouths of those being in prison and on the outside now, and what can we learn and draw from them? Watch this space as we hope to produce something by these amazing heroes in the next little while.
So if we begin to look at a summary of some of the key principles we've touched in our presentation, we have seen that we need a new lens, restoring dignity, identity, and value of every human being. Restorative justice is also compassionate justice. We live and then teach restorative justice. there is a role for communities in reintegration and in developing restorative responses. Restorative justice can be applied to the reintegration of offenders and in turn address their shame, past hurt and trauma, and restore relationships between past offenders, victims, family members, and communities. We as restorative justice practitioners need to come with mindsets of celebration. Restorative justice is a vibrant movement, and we hope to see more of this in our country and across the world.
Thank you for listening to our presentation. As we conclude, we want to say we are excited about this model, being able to equip and empower the church and key leaders around reintegration and violence prevention. Please reach out if this is the area you are working in or are passionate about. We would like to leave you with the following questions and the quote to follow. What does justice mean for you? What fills your cup around justice? What does it mean for you? Are you living restoratively? Are we living restoratively? What does that look like? What can we draw from the stories in WCCORYS model regarding a restorative response around reintegration? Is there one idea you are ready to implement today, this week, and in the future? We wish you well and much blessings.